From the Flint Hills Writing Project, this is the Suggestion Box, where teachers get ideas. I'm your host, Andrea Marshbank. Today we're here with Brian Johnson, who is a gifted educator for secondary, and he's going to talk to us about something that I enjoy a lot as a person who really is into science fiction and fantasy, but even more than that, just science in general, which is world building, and talking about how our students have the capability to build astounding worlds and how we're probably not taking advantage of it like we should. So we're gonna pick his brain about the world building process he goes through with his students and why he does that, and the pros and cons, and all of the fantastic parts of that particular unit and lesson that we can pull our own information out of. So let's get started. How are you doing today, Brian?
Hey, I am doing great. We're in summer. I have been in my recliner too much.
Yeah?
But things are getting done.
That's good.
Things are getting done.
Recliner time is necessary. It's a part of teacher professional development.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a line in the...
Sanity, I believe, too. I've been watching way too much Netflix.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What have you been watching right now?
Altered Carbon was incredible.
So good.
And I'm catching up on the Vikings. Last season of Vikings has been trash so far. But without getting in too much of the Vikings, I just have been extremely disappointed with the storytelling.
Oh no.
But it's given me some ideas that I'm doing with my own writing. So it's been nice to kind of go back and rethink a certain scene that I have, and then suddenly, hey, they did this. This was kind of cool. I want to put that into the setting.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So very cool things.
Yeah. While we're already here, we can just kind of start off before we get into the whole, like the nitty gritty of the world building, is that you are a writer. What have you written that's published? What can our listeners look forward to?
I started off a long time ago writing poetry. There's a couple unpublished anthologies that are out there that have been lost to the winds, but that's okay because looking back at that poetry, sometimes I'm a little embarrassed by it. I've been published with short stories. A couple of years ago, I wrote a novel called Hell to Pay that was written under my full name, William Brian Johnson, and was a story of an alcoholic detective investigating a series of murders that he finds that the perpetrator is possessed. Mm. So a very scary novel before I started thinking about teaching.
Yes, all right.
Which I wish I would have used a pen name. and then I have a second epic fantasy novel I'm 80,000 words into right now, and will hopefully, I'm going to try to be done with it by the end of this month.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
That's a lot. I know you through the Flint Hills Writing Project,
mm-hmm.
which we talk about quite a bit on this podcast,
right.
Because it is, if you've listened to our second episode, our Where We're From episode, it is the origin of all of this idea. So Brian and I, every time I see him, he is writing. So...
Sorry, I'll pay more attention next time.
No.
One thing I want to say about the Flint Hills Writing Project was I have been writing this last novel off and on for 7 years. It's been huge. In that 7 years, I went back and finished my master's, and my master's in academic writing completely destroyed any aspect of creative writing I had. So I had to kind of go back, start reading again, start training to write again. Mm-hmm. And that's one thing that the Flint Hills Project has done for me, is that it has given me that time to write. It has given me the time to read and reflect and try different types of writing that generally, if I was sitting at home, I probably wouldn't have taken.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And to our listeners out there who maybe aren't as familiar with the Flint Hills Writing Project, if you're just tuning in or this is your first couple of episodes, check out episode 2 for more information on this. But also know that I'm not paying Brian to say that. The Flint Hills Project doesn't pay this podcast. We're just partnered. It's just awesome. And you should see if you have a writing project near you. And if you're in Kansas, you should contact the Flint Hills Writing Project. So, world building. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about to give us kind of an overview where we can delve deeper and kind of pick into the different things happening. What does the world building that you do look like in your classroom?
Generally, I teach a 6th grade reading course, and one of the first things that we do is we kind of go over looking at reading from a writer's point of view. I teach a lot of characters and get into Joseph Campbell's archetypes. The hero that generally is an orphan that grows up, doesn't feel like he's part of the world, and then suddenly finds he's this other world. It gets into the hero's journey.
Yeah.
Very big, and I'm very big on teaching the entire hero's journey and how it relates to modern day books and film.
Mm-hmm.
And I always tell kids, this is going to run everything for you from here on out, because now you are going to understand what's happening and know the surprise before it's even talked about.
Oh yeah, Hollywood leans on that.
Yes, and I've actually had parents come in and say, we were watching this movie, and sure enough, they said, hey, I bet this is what happens, and that's what happened.
Yep.
So they do learn something from it, which is a bonus.
Yeah.
But characters as archetypes, settings as genre. So, it's a Western, but suddenly what would happen if we put it into space? Or it's a romance, but what happens if we put supernatural elements into it, or different things like that, and gives us further ideas for that story. And then plotting, we start off very simple with a roller coaster plot, and then get into the hero's journey. And I'll have them plot their favorite books or movies to the hero's journey, and that's kind of the end project on the beginning. Then we roll over to a book. The ELA template that we follow had Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief as the main reading book. First class that I did that had that, I asked them, how many of you kids have read this? 80% of the kids had their hands up. How many of you have read this more than once? There was about 75% of the kids with their hands up. And I'm like, if you guys have read this repeated times, there's no point in us doing this.
Yeah.
And so we went through a lot of the popular fantasy stuff they have read. I teach gifted. My kids tend to read a lot. So I wanted to find something that they hadn't read that would surprise them. And I went all the way back to the Never-Ending Story. Mm-hmm. And first class still yells at me for it, because the Never-Ending Story is truly the Never-Ending Story. It goes on forever.
Oh, no.
There is a part in about halfway through the book that covers what the first movie did way back in the 80s, that ends with this boy finally figuring out what he needs to do. It's kind of the thing that's destroying the world. He does it, he saves the world, and then suddenly he becomes this god. And in him becoming the god originally, that's how I introduced the world building. Mm-hmm. We get to this portion where the kid's building his world, and then I'd have my students kind of tag along, and we would start creating our own places. Generally, we would all get together as a class and figure out kind of a solar system. What sun do we have? Where is our order of planets? How many moons do we have? Give them that general structure, and then everything else was completely up to them. I would have them create a continent, and this continent was kind of their base. Mm-hmm. And we would cut out the continent, and I had a big elongated globe on the wall, mm-hmm. and we would fit the continents to where they thought it would best fit.
Yeah. So to help me real quick, so when you
Sure.
say you have them make a continent, do they have a piece of paper and they actually draw
Uh-huh.
a continent, and then you cut it out and
Yep.
you put it on the world map?
Well, it's a big piece of butcher paper.
Okay.
They trace it out, cut it out to whatever size they feel that they want.
Okay.
And then, those globe maps that it takes the globe and it just elongates it on a flat piece of board. We draw something similar to that.
Ah.
So it's all ocean, and then they place their continents wherever. And we've had some interesting things happen to where continents were next to each other, people that maybe didn't get along. And so they decided to maybe have a war. Or friends would all put their continents together, and then maybe another person would put a continent too close to theirs, and then suddenly they were questioning on how they would get along and things like that. So even though it's an interesting thing on a person building their own continent, we're starting to get into social exercises. We're starting to get into quasi-political problems, mm-hmm. trade wars. What do you have to trade? What would these people want that you have? Would you be willing to trade, or does it become a war situation? Mm-hmm. So we suddenly start looking at these big world problems just with these kids essentially taking shapes and throwing them up on a piece of butcher paper.
Yeah, you've created this whole mock international kind of schema, right? That would be, it makes me think of Model UN, but no offense to Model UN, a little bit cooler, a little bit.
Right,
yeah.
Right, because essentially these guys are the god kings of their little country
right.
that they place. They can make within reason, however things they want to work.
What's the within reason? Because that kind of, I hear a story who's like, Mr. Johnson, what if there's no gravity? Like,
Right. And within, I don't want the one student having something, because I had one student before that he wanted the ability to be armed to the teeth with nuclear bombs. And it was the question of, well, what are you going to do with these nuclear bombs? Well, I'm going to attack everybody. Well, then we have a problem, because you have somebody that is trying to...
We have a puppy in the studio today.
Did you get it? Okay. So I had one kid that wanted to have all the nuclear warheads so he could attack generally whoever he wanted to when he wanted to. And the problem with that is suddenly we have a dictator or somebody that is wanting what everybody else has with the power to essentially force everybody else to give it. That's not quite where I wanted to go with this. Yeah. Now, I try to push not a lot of rules, because this is something I want kids to really try to spread their wings creatively. And I think a lot of times in schools we have problems with that, because we give them an idea, we give a very small border to that idea, and then we give a rubric which even sometimes will fence in the ideas more to where we want to go. A lot of times I will state you have to have a person or a population. Your population has to have a certain number of traits. Your population has this that they excel in. And it can be maybe science, it could be farming, it can be some sort of trade. And then you have to come up with 2 weaknesses of your population, whether that is, oh, well, my people don't like sunlight, or my people have a problem with they can't eat fish, or sometimes very odd things come up. Sometimes kids have allergies to food and they say, hey, you know what? None of my people can stand peanuts. Peanuts make them die. Yeah. So we have that type of situation happen.
Do you get any inspiration from, oh, I'm gonna expose myself, but that's okay. We're all nerds here, right? Like, this sounds a little bit to me like role playing or Dungeons and Dragons. Like, it sounds very like, it's almost like, I think it would be interesting if you had like a list of weaknesses and they had to like roll a die and like those were there too.
I have that. I'm a gamer nerd. Yeah. I've played D&D since junior high, so I've not thought about that. That would be kind of cool to bring in. I'm sure old issues of Dungeon, or was it Dragon magazine, probably has old tables for weaknesses and odd character weaknesses and things like that.
There's a lot of stuff on Reddit too.
Which is an interesting lesson for him, because one of the things I do try to tie this into is NaNoWriMo.
Oh, okay.
And NaNoWriMo starts in November, and it's National Write a Novel in a Month. And it's insane, but years that I have kids that show high creative output and ability, I'll try to get them to do NaNoWriMo. And it's one of the things I'm very careful about grading too hard on. I don't want to sound like my class is all fun and games and I don't ever grade on anything. But when somebody is trying to be creative for the first time and they are unaware of potential and what they can do, especially with high achieving students, a lot of times they'll go for what's safe. And you won't get these out of the box ideas. And I want to see the out of the box ideas. So I'll tell them, you have a word count of 1,500 words. To a kid, that sounds huge. It's not that much. But if I give them enough time and tell them, you need some homework time on this, go home and try to write 100 words tonight. See what they can do. And with this world building and the setup, or teaching the settings and characters and things like that, it gives them a little bit of a basis to do this. Another thing of the world building that I have them do is I always have them create a hero. And it's a person in history. Doesn't always have to be a warrior, doesn't always have to be a leader type. I mean, sometimes it's like Clara Barton type. This person figured out how to cure this, and this is my hero of my civilization. Because I want them to think of, since they've created a race of people, give me an example of that person.
Okay. So just to kind of reframe this, so you talk a lot about the world, structure and like a little bit of universe structure, pull in the how does our world change when we change what the universe looks like, and kind of create like a class version of that. and then they create their continents, they cut them out, they put them in this very tangible, like, physical space, and kind of get a sense of like how the physicality of a country can affect the political climate.
Right.
And along with a whole bunch of other nuanced things going on there. And then they're charged to create this population, all of these different characteristics that you require that help like really round out what they're creating. And then they write.
Right.
Okay.
Most times. I've had years that my creative types are not that strong, and that the kids are really pushing against me for large writing assignments. And so on that, I may change it to where we may dip into this world building at a couple times. One would be when we're doing the Never-Ending Story. And then there's another one towards the end of the year that we are doing a science fiction study, and we're using Holt's Anthology of Science Fiction. And there's a great story called Harry's All Night Hamburgers, and it's a story about a kid at this little greasy spoon rest stop that he figures out is the nexus point in multiple universes. And so he has the chance to actually go on and jump a ride with somebody to go to all these multiple universes. The problem is nobody can figure out how to get home. And so it's this choice of whether should he stay or should he go. And then I have the kids build a universe based on essentially open thinking. Build your own universe. You want to make something that you're around a black hole, go for it. And I've had some very interesting things with that. Had some things that I wasn't real happy about. I had a lot of presidential assassinations this last time to where it's almost like everybody discussed, let's do this before we move on. And it's like I had half the class talking about either a great war or the president getting assassinated, calamity, dystopia, and then this had happened. And so, yeah, I wasn't real happy with that one. It wasn't quite the open thinking that I normally see.
Yeah, I think that as educators, a lot of times we see our students slip into I don't want to say that it's lazy writing per se or lazy anything, because I've watched a fair amount of like very violent things and been entertained in its own right, but I think that sometimes they fall onto I don't know what to write about, and then they've got a lot of experience with violence for whatever reason. Right.
It's my Fortnite fanfics. Yeah, I have a lot of kids that are living Fortnite right now.
Oh yeah.
And you can see that sometimes when you walk down the hall and other teachers are doing art assignments and you start seeing Fortnite maps up on the wall. It's like, okay, build your own country. Well, that's Fortnite. And they have it labeled Fortnite. And it's like, kids, get out of that.
Yeah.
Unplug for a while.
Right. And we need to, you're encouraging them to have their own problem solving, to ask the questions that you said before, where you were like the what if, what if, and recreating somebody else's vision is not a what if.
Right. And that was Stephen King in his on writing book. That was one of his strongest things that stuck with me, is when he looks at a situation, that's what gets him his ideas, is he goes, what if?
Absolutely. And I think that that's a concept that could be expanded to any classroom.
Oh yeah.
Especially when you get into those places of inquiry-based and choice-based learning and those areas. Like I could imagine how you reference that you have your students pick a figure from history and base their hero off of that. Like you're basically saying, like, what if Harriet Tubman had to deal with this scenario?
Right.
What if, George Washington hadn't had the support of, certain people in his life? Like, and, it could be varying levels of what if. Some are very small, like we're going to change one thing, right? Kind of butterfly effect. And some are, I keep coming back to like no gravity. I need to write. I don't know why I'm fascinated with that.
In the historical unit, we have Lincoln's grave robbers. And I actually did not have time to do that this year, which I was a little disappointed. But there is a book called Lincoln's Grave Robbers. I'm not a huge fan of it. It's kind of a lower end book. The reading's not real high, but it's a true story of some people that decided to try to kidnap Abraham Lincoln's body and hold it for ransom. And in that, I feed Killing Lincoln, which was one of Bill O'Reilly's books. And Bill O'Reilly's a professor of history. I don't know if a lot of people know that or not. His writing doesn't tend to be as politically charged as it shows. And when they did the Lincoln movie, they ended up doing this documentary kind of hand in hand. And it was a wonderful documentary that looked at the life of Lincoln's killer, John Wilkes Booth, and took you back and kind of did a parallel study of what their lives were like right up to the assassination and then what happened to Wilkes afterwards. I learned a ton of it. And one of the things I love to teach the kids is think about alternate history. What would have happened if we would have never had the Civil War? And there's a book I've been reading off and on called Underground Airlines. And it's a story of what would have happened if we never had the Civil War and slavery never was abolished.
I feel like there's a show on Hulu that's doing pretty well about like what if Germany had won World War II?
Man in the Iron Castle?
Yeah,
yes, that's
right.
an Amazon made that, and it's based upon, I forget the author. He's a big sci-fi
is
guy.
It a book?
Yeah, it was a series of books that came out, and yeah, that's a hard show to watch.
Is it?
Yeah.
I bet. And I like it's pulling on all of the skills that you're trying to give your students through these units like this, where we have to consider that every day in history is a possibility for something to go like terribly right or terribly wrong.
Exactly.
So when you are going through this process and they're writing, when you have students who, you talked about some years you have students who are much more inclined for longer writing assignments than others, how do you spur those who are struggling with this idea of like, you want me to build an entire world? Like, how do you have any prompts that you give them to help pull that out?
We do a lot of writing tables, and I try to get them to discuss what they're working on and what they're having problems with. Because
what is a writing table?
Writing table is when I split people into groups and groups that they're not frequently accustomed to. I don't put friends together. I put people that went to other schools together, because I'm at a middle school. We have 5 feeder schools, so I know where the kids came from. And so one of the things I like to do is put kids next to each other that don't know each other, and they're working off their stories, and they're reading the stories, and they're sharing what their worlds are like and what their ideas are like and what their problems are. I want the kids to identify their problems early. It's another problem kind of higher level kids have, is having issues with things, because some kids will completely shut down. And some kids have the ability to figure it out, go ask for help. A large percentage of these kids have never asked for help for anything in their lives. And it's the first time that they're coming up with a hiccup. And I've had kids just completely lose it over this assignment before, saying, I can't do this because this isn't my way of thinking. Those type of kids I sit down with, I work with them at the writer's table. We go through what their society's like, what the problems are they're having. And trust me, world building's not an easy thing. With my novel Aristide that I'm doing right now, there are several things that I came up with and started running with, and upon rewrites and adding layers to it, realized I didn't have the structure I needed. And so you have to go back and you have to develop and you have to build. And the more I have done this, the more I realize why J.K. Rowling has such a thick world and all these things that she can pull off of and all these characters that she could go and write books about, is because this starts taking a life of its own after a while.
Have you had students who have reached, that's kind of the opposite problem. Have you had students who maybe get so into it, maybe it's not a problem now that I say that, but get so into it that they create have almost surprised you maybe?
Yes. I had one student that actually, I made a deal with him. I gave him 5 years to do something with this thing that he wrote. He's in high school now. And he came back to me and he goes, you can have it. It's yours. I never did anything with it. And it's this kind of Doctor Who ripoff, and we've talked about this before in the project, but it's essentially a guy that wanders around with a trash dumpster, and he can jump into the trash dumpster, and when he jumps to the trash dumpster, it's kind of, he goes into a multiple universe. And his ideas were so fresh and so fun, I ended up stealing that idea from him. And I told him, if I ever do anything with this, I will give you the acknowledgement. And he's like, run with it. So it's on the back burner right now. I've played around with some ideas. I would love to do it as an episodic, kind of almost like a magazine, and put one out at like maybe every 3 months or something, and just kind of see what happens.
What if you did that as a podcast?
That would be fun.
Like,
yeah,
like a serial, not like Serial, the podcast. That's
so, that's actually something that's come up in the last few years, that people are doing their books as podcasts and getting interest in it, at least.
Yeah, no, there's I love Homecoming, which is done by Gimlet. Have you listened to that? It's not a book done as a podcast. It's a podcast with the very definite, like when they tell the story, you can tell it's meant to be a podcast. Like, it's very audio oriented, but I loved it. And I think that would be really interesting to experiment with like science fiction that way. And that would kind of breach into a whole, like, if you had a student who was really struggling with writing, or who was doing really well with writing and wanted to branch out.
Yeah. And the interesting thing is, I talk about this world that this kid has helped me create. And I've actually had students give me wonderful ideas that I've ended up using, because one of them is this quasi-dimensional character that survives in all realms of all multi-universes. And he's kind of the mentor to my character. And he runs a food truck. And he has a name that I'm not going to pronounce, so I don't have somebody running off with it until I do the first episode. But he exists everywhere. He knows everything, and he's kind of the one that the guy goes to figure out what the problem is.
Yeah, I think that it's a really engaging story. So everybody keep an eye out for when Brian comes out with this. Would you use a pen name for this one?
I've missed the pen name train because
it's too late.
It's too late. I've won awards for my writing before, and yeah, it kills me, because I mean, I've had students look at my horror novel and they're like, "Ooh, I'm going to buy this." And it's like, no, you're not. I will so call your parents if I find out you bought this.
That's so funny. That makes me think a little bit of like when you're trying to explain to kids how their like online presence matters. So you Google your first and last name, or have the whole class Google like the teacher's first and last name, and then you see like Andrea Marshbank, 7th grader, from the the Capital Journal online newspaper, because they just never took that photo down. So there's me, my shiny forehead.
I had a wonderful, probably one of the best in-depth interviews was with a horror magazine that is out of Scotland.
Oh yeah.
And they run themselves under the Ginger Nuts of Horror.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, funny name, but this guy did a huge interview with me, and some of my kids have found that online and read it, and they're like, Mr. Johnson, you said this in this interview, and it's like, no, don't go there.
So how do you use your experience as a writer to help empathize with the kids, or to like, how does that affect your teaching of this world building?
It's not easy. And I tell the kids, it's not easy. Don't lose your mind over this. Work on it. See what you can do. See what you can come up with. If you run into problems, talk to somebody, talk to me, talk to others. Take ideas that you're listening to, kind of open yourself up, observe, listen to things being said, and then, like that Stephen King thing, what if? See how things go. Maybe you can. That's one of the ways I tend, when I write myself into a corner, is I take a break, I go out, maybe I'll go to a coffee house, I'll go to a bar somewhere, sit around and just listen to people talk. If that doesn't do it, I have this wonderful deck of cards that was put out by the NaNoWriMo people that is cards that if you write yourself into a wall, you pull a card and it says, okay, now give your character all the power to do what they need to. But instead of giving them all the power, give them too much. What happens? Or suddenly your protagonist is given another job. He doesn't want it. What does he do? Because that also goes into character. You have some character, Superman. Whatever you give to Superman, he's going to do. Batman's going to walk away from things that he cannot get done.
Right. So it involves a lot of like the nuances of what your character would do.
Right.
Do you think that maybe helps out with empathy in your students?
I think a huge amount, because they can sit there sometimes and tell what a character would do in a situation, but sometimes when you look at them and ask them what they would do, they can't give you an answer.
Interesting. I guess my next follow-up question is, do you ever see students write themselves into these?
Yeah, I see a lot of writing themselves. Really, the biggest thing is the kids that don't have a lot of creativity. I see them writing who they know. I see a lot of Harry Potter-ish fanfic, or Pokemon, or the Fortnite reared its ugly head this year, even though I don't understand Fortnite very much. A lot of kids were writing into that kind of realm of, well, I landed here and started fighting everybody. It's like, okay, I need a story here.
Yeah.
You're just giving me action without any meaning.
Because can we just all acknowledge, okay, like, Fortnite is based on Hunger Games. Okay, like let's just put it out there. And
I haven't even thought about that.
Hunger.
Now, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory was the original Hunger
There
Games.
you go.
Yeah.
How far back can we go? I'm sure there's even more. I'm sure there's like a teacher out there who's like, Willy Wonka was based on. I really enjoy how you have this huge intersection of a whole bunch of different subjects interlocking into this massive project that you expect your students to do, even though it is difficult. And so you talked about how you teach gifted students, and it is a little stressful to push a child to do things that they're uncomfortable with or that feels like too much,
right.
Especially when for most, and I mean even for like your kids who don't want to do work, but like with your students who are so high level that like asking for help, raising their hand, they're like on the other end of the spectrum with that, where they haven't had experiences of not understanding immediately, and so it's tough for them to go through that. As you've referenced earlier, have you experienced pushback maybe in specific ways from your students, maybe from parents, from teachers, or is this something that everybody's just like, it's good?
Originally I did. I've had a lot of pushback, probably more on the side of students going, I can't do this, I'm not a creative type, and I tell them to try. And I tell them, when I give an assignment, it's based upon, did you include these things? If you included these things, experiment. Try, go out in left field, see what you can come up with something strange. Our rules in the classroom is what happens in Mr. Johnson's classroom stays in Mr. Johnson's classroom, because there's a lot of kids that try things that maybe don't work. Well, that we go back and workshop it. We'll talk about it. Why didn't it work? Why did this group over here not care for what this person was talking about? And it can be biased on personal views or things like that, but it's thought-provoking. It kind of gets the kids' perspective on who they are and what the other kids do, and create these worlds.
Yeah. So based on some of your comments earlier, your students have, it seems like, maybe like self-identified some like types, like creative, logical, or like maybe like STEM versus humanities.
Right.
And so I wonder, just on your opinion and your experiences and the things you've read, do you feel like creativity can be developed?
Oh boy. Yeah, I think there are some kids, I think a lot of kids that have a logical, mathematical, maybe computer science mindset, creativity is very hard for them. So if I have a child that's set in this mindset that I'm more science than creative, what can I do? I tell them, okay, I want you to think about, you're landing in this world as a biologist, you're landing in this world as a botanist. Explain to me what you see. And we've had a lot of fun with that. I've hit a lot of kids looking at that science-y part of it and then trying to delve into it and figure out how things work. Still though, occasionally, like I said, I have the kids that get locked in the, okay, this is Harry Potter mixed up with Pokemon, or this is nothing more than a Percy Jackson mismatch of other deities, and this is what happened when I mixed them all together. I let them run with it. Because, I mean, they're still trying to exceed what was normal. Did they make something? Yes. Is it maybe to the nth degree that a creative type would have done? Maybe not, but the thing is, they tried. They got their foot in the creative waters. They tried to go forward with it a little bit. They may put it away and never deal with it again, but hey, that's fine.
Yeah.
Because at least they showed that out of the box thinking, or attempted that out of the box thinking.
Right. And I know there's a lot of research out kind of on both sides of the spectrum. Like some research has explained like, we should be teaching students, or like I read a lot of books on leadership. We ourselves should be trying to bolster up our weaknesses. But I've read, I don't know if it's just as many books, but just as much powerful literature on the, like, you should lean into your strengths instead. Like, don't worry so much about those.
There's a lot of talk, especially with higher end kids that really, they make straight A's all the time, that the first time that they don't make that straight A, it kills them. That it's a train wreck. And even in engineering, they're beginning to say we are getting too many kids that have been coddled to be right all the time. That suddenly we run into a situation that they made something, it doesn't work, and their world falls apart. That's what I want to start introducing, at least in middle school, is I want these kids to understand nothing is always going to be perfect. There's going to be times that things don't work. Learn the skill set it takes to figure out what's wrong with it, come back around and redevelop it.
Yeah, I think that resilience, right? The word grit gets tossed around a ton with the TED Talk by Dr. Angela Duckworth. We are in the process of kind of redefining our English department and vertically aligning and all of those things that definitely have to happen every few years. And one of the things we brought up that really correlates with what you said is that it's not necessarily, because we're in the day and age of the internet where like all of, Bloom's taxonomy had to be redone, because like the idea that you have to have this like large bottom of the pyramid of is knowledge that doesn't exist, because knowledge is in your back pocket now, right? That rote memorization. And so now we're giving kids the tools to problem solve. Like, do you need to remember that the Battle of Hastings was 1066 for the rest of your life? Maybe not, but you need to know how to effectively find that out. And you've got to develop that motivation to do so, right? Like your kids who get stuck. I mean, I kind of wonder if the difference, and this is like very oversimplifying, but if the difference between your kids who identify as creatives and your kids who don't, it's just the like motivation factor, right? Like if kid who's creative gets stuck, they're like, okay, how are we going to fix this? Versus the other kid who's like,
it's not logical. I can't go forward.
Yeah.
And I also try to tell kids there are two types in this life. You have, the creative and the logical is one type, but the other thing is the consumer and the producer. And I always tell them, what do you want to be? Do you want to be that kid that's in front of a computer playing somebody else's game, or do you want to be the person that wrote that game making the millions of dollars?
Who's also in front of a computer.
He's also in front of the computer and maybe doing the same thing, but he's getting paid for it.
Yes.
So, it's the thing of, because I see a lot of kids, and I see even adults anymore, creativity tends to take a back seat. We're in Wichita right now, or near Wichita, and they're kind of starting a creative renaissance. We're starting to get all sorts of artists starting to emerge from town. Downtown Wichita is starting to show all sorts of galleries and things like that. And I think it's interesting to see what's happening here, because we used to be an aircraft town, and that's what we were known for, was an aircraft town, and everything was based upon aircraft, but we've lost a lot of that. So since we've lost a lot of it, we've had to reinvent ourselves, and I think we're starting to see that.
Yeah. Is there, kind of bouncing off of this idea of a creative renaissance here in Wichita, Kansas, do you see any opportunities, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you see any opportunities to integrate, maybe like you integrate the community in the NaNoWriMo project itself, because that's definitely outside of the realm of your school, but maybe in like, I don't know, is there a way to kind of weave in this creative renaissance with your students who are practicing being creative, essentially?
I think so. I mean, we have the area that I teach at has a local rec center that's now putting on plays. That's new, and it's like, that's an outlet. What if you wrote a play? Maybe you could get somebody to do it. We have a special needs coffee shop in the area too that has a great upstairs that's essentially its own little stage area if they need it. Stuff like that could be put up there. So I mean, it's based on the area and kind of what the society needs are. And I mean, there's all sorts of things that can happen. And we're also starting to see a lot of small businesses start to launch in the area too. We have the big businesses too, but there's a lot of small businesses that are starting to get going in this town. And I like to see that, and I like to tell the kids, you may have $1 million idea with it someday. Run with it. See what happens.
I think that's you're kind of developing this entrepreneurial, I mean, for the lack of the better word that we've used a lot, like creativity. They've got to be able to research when they get stuck. They have to be able to know, okay, how do I make this different so that people will be interested, right? If you make another video game just like Fortnite, there will be too many Fortnites.
What's going to be the one thing that's going to differentiate you from everybody else?
we were conducting a writing camp recently, and one of my older students said, when we asked like what their goals were, the students' goals for the writing camp, she explained like, I want to know what makes words matter, which was poignant because it was the name of the writing camp. But she was really, I know, very punny.
Yeah.
And so we had this discussion about how, you know, impactful writing is based on like a context of scenarios. Like it's what the world or the community that it's released to needs to read, and a mixture of what like the author needs to write and all that.
Well, and there's an interesting argument there, because are you writing for what you want to write, or are you writing for what you think sells? Because the old days of publishing, if you wrote a book, it may be 2, 3, 4 years before that book ever hits paper. If you're going through a publishing company, agents, editors, whatever, if you're writing for what's hot at the time, you may have missed the boat. So a lot of times you just kind of write what you want to write. I don't even want to say write what you know, because seriously, the last 2 books that I wrote, I had no idea what it was about. I did a ton of research. Love Google, love the internet, love the fact that I've talked to people that were interested in helping me with this, so that I didn't completely go off the rails and give a false report of what it's like to be a police officer.
Yeah.
So, are you really Dirty Harry? No. But yeah, I always shudder when I hear people say write what you know, because it's not that. It's write what you want to write. Write what you want to figure out.
Right. I only know really boring things, so what am I gonna do? You know, no, I'm just kidding.
You would be amazed.
I think that you bring up, when you say research to figure out what you write, I know that a lot of really well-known authors, I am a fan of every once in a while, the Nora Roberts, very like superficial romance novel. And Nora Roberts, if you ever hear this, I'm sorry, but you've written the same book like 60 times, but I'm gonna buy it every time, Nora Roberts. And she's talked about how she's actually not a huge fan of flying. And so she is very open about like a lot of her stuff. She just calls around different places and like Googles and figures it out. And I wonder, I'm over here in my head thinking like, wouldn't it be so neat to have like an elective course that's like an entire semester, that's just like, we're gonna write a book, and then you incorporate all of the research that is writing a book, because our kids, they do rely on what they know, right? That's how we get that very fanfic, very Harry Potter. But if we push them to okay, we're gonna research all of these different things, and that's gonna lead you to write, you know, things you don't know about, or things that you can then ask questions about, or you know, you can fake what you know.
There was a book I started it was actually my first novel attempt, and it was based out of a small park in Minnesota. And I happened to write, I've never been to Minnesota, wrote the park office of this great national park out there and said, hey, I'm wanting to base a book in this area. Can you give me maybe a couple maps? Not only did they send me maps, I had brochures, I had everything that was going on in this little area, and I still have it. So I mean, it's like I can unfold it and see exactly where everything is laid out in the town, in nearby towns, what's going on in the nearby towns, what's going on in the parks, what the main biology is in the parks and main plants. And I mean, I got more information than I ever thought I would have. And just that was just a simple email that I had sent to the park department saying, hey, I'd like to base something here. Can you tell me more about it?
Yeah. People are excited to help if they, you know, as long as it's a reasonable request.
Right. Yeah, you always want to, you don't want to burden somebody with it, but you want to have a simple request.
So for a drastic change in topic here, you've mentioned the hero's journey before, which I love to use for teaching for students. We do it kind of backwards, because like the whole phenomenon of the hero's journey, for any listeners who aren't familiar, it's this idea that I think was piloted by Joseph Campbell, in that he read a bunch of stories, like folklore, religious stories, myths,
Joseph Campbell was the world's most renowned mythologist.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
And one of the reasons he kind of came up, he wrote a book called Hero of a Thousand Faces.
Right, the monomyth.
Right, and that was the hero's journey, essentially in rough book form. George Lucas was a student of his, and when he was writing Star Wars, he consulted Joseph Campbell on Luke Skywalker, Obi-Wan Kenobi, Yoda, and Darth Vader, and he essentially helped him kind of create this hero cycle.
Oh, okay. So maybe what I'm having my kids do isn't quite so backwards, because a lot of what Joseph had talked about, it's like we're pals. A lot of what good old Joe had talked about was that this pattern, the heroic journey, happens a lot because as a human society, like even across cultures, we really like this idea of one person doing really well, or one small group doing really well, or being kind of like the savior complex. And so in my class, the way we do it is I have them, we learn about the hero's journey. We watch the only movie we watched all year.
Go.
We watch the only movie we watch all year, and we align it with the hero's journey. It's Inception, if you're wondering.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and it's a whole story about why we watch Inception, but it's our film as literature unit. And then they take the hero's journey and they write within the story. Like I don't give them the freedom to like I do give them freedom. Like I've had students come up to me and say like, my hero actually died, so I can't have like a return to the status quo or a new life. And we have to talk about, okay, but you wouldn't just end the book when your hero died, right? You'd like pick it up from like the mother's perspective and what happens, and it creates, but it is kind of backwards. And they've had quite a bit of success with that. I have some students that have written me like 30-page stories, which is a trip to grade, but awesome to get.
Yeah. And I always tell people, you know, when you have a hero that has problems, I mean, you look at the mentor. Is the mentor able to help him over it? But you have to be careful with the mentor, because you don't want it to be the mentor's story. Obi-Wan, if he was strong enough, would have been the hero in Star Wars. The problem was he was old, and he knew that his days were numbered, so to be able to maintain with Luke, he sacrificed himself. Gandalf was all powerful, and so, you know, he ended up kind of sacrificing himself when the fight with the Balrog, which I still get into an argument with people about. Fly, you fools. It could have just been him saying, hey, go get an eagle, ride it to Mordor, throw it over into the thing, and be done with it. But no.
Have you read the books, though? Because in the books they talk about why that can't happen. They're like, there's a relationship with the eagles that's very tenuous.
Yeah, I know. They wouldn't dare do that. But yeah, I talk a lot about archetypes. I have a podcast called Coffee and Catastrophe. I write with I do the podcast with my writing partner, D.A. Bell, and we just discuss writing, the process of writing, and the business of writing, which is getting more and more strenuous because people are going into self-publishing more than ever before. Used to be self-publishing was kind of you couldn't get published, and so you published it. And now it is more along the lines of something that everybody tends to do. The problem is there's a lot of static out there, and there's a lot of difficulty getting yourself known as a self-published author when everybody else is self-publishing. But that's what Amazon has done to us.
Yeah.
So on Coffee and Catastrophe, season 1, episodes 14 and 15, we go really deep into archetypes and do a lot of explanation. And I think episode 13 of that was I started talking plot roller coaster, and looking back at my episodes, I realized I need to do a strong hero's journey. And if you're interested in Coffee and Catastrophe, you can either look it up on Podomatic.com, or my website, fatherthunder.blogspot.com, has links to it.
Okay. Before we move on, I want Brian to explain his website named Father Thunder, because I think it's great, but it's relevant. It's relevant. And I just want to provide some backstory before you were like, I liked this guy, Intel. No. So why is it called that?
Many reasons. One is because I'm a storm chaser. And since I lead a lot of the storm chasing things, I always had kind of people refer to me as Father Thunder. But there was a poem I read one night that talked about Father Thunder, Mother Night, that I just was like, oh, this sounds awesome. So that's kind of how I became the Father Thunder moniker on the writing side.
Nice. I didn't know that for the poem reason, so that's awesome. But yeah, Brian does a lot of really beautiful photography with his storm chasing too. Isn't that on your website as well?
My storm chasing website is ruminationofthunder.com.
Okay, very thunder oriented.
Yes, very thunder oriented. Yeah, the problem is both of my books start off with weather, and they always say, don't start off with weather, whatever you do.
On a dark and stormy night.
Dark and stormy night, exactly. And what was that from?
Oh God, I don't even know.
You don't?
No, I just thought it was a thing we don't like tell kids not to start with. Like, I don't know.
Well, Snoopy, of course, did Dark and Stormy Night, but also, the book that just became a movie. I just went blank on it. A Wrinkle in Time.
Oh!
A Wrinkle in Time starts off with, it was a dark and stormy night.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being here today.
Certainly.
It was great to talk to you about world building and kind of the process of challenging our students to be more creative and all of that. So we will keep an eye out for
Dark Cry of Aristid. I should hopefully be done with it in June. I'm gonna actually try to sell it.
All right. So publishers out there who are, of course, avidly listening to the suggestion
anybody
box.
from Tor, Wizards of the West Coast, looking for the next great book. This is gonna run me.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Brian. We
Certainly.
really appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening to our episode today. We had an awesome conversation with Brian about world building, about creativity, about what makes our students, typecast themselves the way that they do, and about the hero's journey. Make sure you check out his podcast, and we'll link all of his stuff down in the show notes below, as well as a really informational video about the hero's journey that comes from TED Ed that I use every single year. Super great. If you liked this episode of the suggestion box or want to support us or teachers or the idea of teachers teaching teachers, please subscribe, review us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. We're also available on Google Play, SoundCloud, and YouTube. Just search the Suggestion Box Podcast. We'll pop right up. If you have a suggestion, make sure that you let us know. Send us an email at thesuggestionboxpodcast@gmail.com or go through the website. We've got a contact us form on there, and tell us. We'd love to have you on the in the interview process. We'd love to get your view on something that you think could be suggested to teachers all around the nation. We're also on social media, the Suggestion Box Podcast. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. So support us. Help us out. We want to help you out. Special thank you to Dr. Heather and Roger Caswell, who make my dreams come true through this podcast a reality every single day. They're with the Flint Hills Writing Project. And also to our absolutely terrific graphic designer, Kristen McGriff, and to Sonic Tonic Audio, who created the intro and outro tunes for this particular podcast. All right, everybody. See you next time.